Hi there, and welcome to the Daily Gardener, and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling. It's January 29th. Today we celebrate the German-American botanist who saved the French wine industry and the very first iris breeder who urged other hybridizers to be bold. We'll learn about the woman who sparked significant legislative change after birds and insects were killed in her garden, and the man who fought to protect habitat for the blazing star. In Unearthed Words, we celebrate two award-winning American poets and review their poems about the garden. And we grow that garden library with a book that shows how gardening has changed the way we eat. I'll talk about a garden item that will get your garden or porch ready for a party. And then we'll wrap things up with a story within a story about a man who loved apples and a man who helped settle the West. But first, let's catch up on a few recent events. Here's today's curated articles. First up is a post from the National Wildlife Federation about feeding the birds. The title of the article is called Seeds and Berries, and here's an excerpt. As a wildlife gardener, you can help wildlife have a year-round bounty by leaving the seed heads and berries intact in your garden while still weeding or clearing some lower branches and leaves as needed. Seed-eating birds like juncos and goldfinches enjoy the dried flower heads of asters, coneflowers, and other native plants. Winter wildflower stalks provide wildlife with places to seek refuge from storms and predators, and insects pass the winter in the dead stalks. And, it points out, these stalks and seed pods add texture and visual interest in an otherwise barren landscape in the winter. This fabulous article from the National Wildlife Federation reminds us that the best winter fruiting plants for wildlife are native trees and shrubs. So this summer, when you're working on your garden, work to incorporate more native trees and shrubs into your landscape. If you'd like to read this post for yourself, just search for berries in the free Facebook group for the show, and this post will pop up. Next up was a post from National Geographic. It shared a video that revealed that the rare ghost orchid actually has multiple pollinators. A team of researchers went deep into the remotest parts of Florida swamps and captured video of the rare ghost orchid being pollinated. Prior to this video, these beautiful orchids were thought to be pollinated by only one insect, the giant sphinx moth. But now, thanks to photographs by Carlton Ward Jr. and Max Stone, we know that a couple of different moth species, other than the giant sphinx, visit and carry away the ghost orchid's pollen. This post actually features a beautiful short film from National Geographic that takes you into the Florida swamp, where you can see images of this beautiful rare ghost orchid. It's definitely worth checking out. If you'd like to do so, just search for Ghost in the Facebook group for the show, and this post will pop up. Now, if you'd like to check out these curated articles for yourself, you're in luck, because I share all of them with the listener community in the free Facebook group for the show, the Daily Gardener Community. So there's no need to take notes or search for links. The next time you're on Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community and request to join. I'd love to meet you in the group. Here's today's brevities. On this day in 1879, Dorothea Engelmann, the wife of the physician and botanist George Engelmann, died. Dorothea was also his cousin, and the couple had married in their native Germany before immigrating to the United States. George settled in St. Louis, Missouri, and George and Dorothea had one son, George Jr., who became a noted gynecologist. George persuaded Henry Shaw to develop the gardens around his estate outside of St. Louis. When Asa Gray indicated that he thought George should run Shaw's garden, George replied that he wasn't interested, that Shaw was a man who had, quote, no real scientific zeal. Yet George continued to interact with Shaw, and he encouraged him to name his garden the Missouri Botanical Garden. He did. Today, the Missouri Botanical Garden is sometimes referred to as Shaw's Garden. George Engelmann became the Missouri Botanical Garden's first botanist. Among George's many accomplishments as a botanist, at the top of the list is the time George rescued the French wine industry. During the 1870s, the grapes in French vineyards were under attack by phylloxera. Without intervention, the old European vines would never survive the little aphid-like pest that sucked the sap out of the roots of the grapevines. By the time the French government dispatched a scientist to St. Louis, Engelmann had been studying grapes for over 20 years. George offered a simple solution when he suggested replacing the European vines with American ones. George had already determined that the American vines were naturally resistant to phylloxera. The simple substitution of vines would eliminate the problem. Both sides agreed, and George personally arranged for millions of grapevines, as well as grape seeds, to be sent to France. And voila, the French wine industry was saved. As a person, George was quite cheerful, and he was always working, either as a physician or pursuing his botanical or other scientific work. But after Dorothea died, on this day in 1879, George was distraught. Dorothea had been his partner in all of his endeavors. She was his sounding board, editor, and chief encourager. George threw himself into his botanical work, but alone he could find no relief from his grief. George's way back to life came when an invitation arrived from a friend and colleague. Harvard's Charles Sprague Sargent requested that George join him on an assessment of the forests of the Pacific Coast on behalf of the Forestry Division of the United States Census. George was Charles's top choice. He had long admired George's mastery of trees. By the summer of 1880, George Engelmann was 71 years old, and life wasn't done with him yet. George met up with Charles in Ogden, Utah, and along with the botanist Charles Christopher Perry, they spent the summer of 1880 botanizing along the west coast from the Fraser River in British Columbia to southern Arizona along the Mexican border. George's death came 4 years later. He caught a cold after he was clearing a path through the snow from his house to his garden so that he could read his thermometers. George had faithfully kept an unbroken record of daily weather observations for nearly 5 decades. It was important to him. He recorded the daily, monthly, seasonal, and annual records of temperature, rainfall, and other weather notes. A prolific letter writer, George's last letter was to Charles Christopher Perry, who had accompanied George and Sargent on their botanizing trip to the West. Perry was a true friend, and he had named the Engelmann spruce in honor of George. In a tribute to George after his death, Charles Sprague Sargent wrote, "That splendid spruce, the Engelmann spruce, the fairest of them all, will forever cover the noble forests and the highest slopes of the mountains, recalling the memory of a pure, upright, and laborious life." Today, George's portrait is featured in a couple of different places at the Missouri Botanical Garden, where his astounding collection of over 98,000 botanical specimens helped establish the Missouri Botanical Garden's herbarium. If you ever visit the Missouri Botanical Garden's Sachs Museum, you'll note that the only plant identified with a label is named for George Engelmann. It's the Opuntia engelmannii, or Engelmann's prickly pear cactus. There's also a large bust of Engelmann in the Strassenfest Garden. Today, Engelmann's botanical notebooks are being digitized online as part of the Biodiversity Heritage Library. And today is the anniversary of the death of the English physician and iris breeder, Sir Michael Foster, who died on this day in 1907. In the late 1890s, Michael became the first person to crossbreed and name new varieties of iris. Michael started working with purple and yellow iris. He was successfully able to produce a beautiful blend by the third generation. In short order, Michael was receiving large wild iris specimens from all over the world. Missionaries were a great help to him, and they sent Trojana, Cypriana, and Mesopotamica specimens from the deserts in the Near East. Over time, Michael was able to create irises with bigger blooms and habits with higher and wider branching stems. Michael crossed late bloomers with early bloomers and created intermediate bloomers. He once wrote to his friend, the breeder William John Caparn, advising, "In hybridizing, be bold." And Michael gave us a clue to how he regarded his work with the natural world when he said, "Nature is ever making signs to us. She is ever whispering to us the beginnings of her secrets." In 1888, Michael introduced Mrs. Horace Darwin, a white iris with pale violet markings, which he had named after one of his neighbors, the daughter-in-law of Charles Darwin. Michael often named his iris in honor of his many female friends. After Michael's work became well known, iris breeding took off. 13 years after Michael's death, the American Iris Society was founded in 1920. Today, there are thousands of varieties of iris. And here's one final tidbit about Sir Michael Foster. Like many botanists, Michael was a doctor. In 1877, he discovered and documented a phenomenon he called the patellar reflex. And he noted that, quote, striking the tendon below the patella gives rise to a sudden extension of the leg, known as the knee jerk. And it was on this day in 1958 that the Duxbury resident, journalist, and nature lover Olga Owens Huckins wrote a letter to the editor that appeared in the Boston Herald in Section 3 on page 14 and was titled Evidence of Havoc by DDT. Olga and her husband Stuart had created a little bird sanctuary around 2 kettle ponds on their property. It was a place where songbirds sang, ducks swam, and great blue herons nested. When the Massachusetts State Mosquito Control Program began spraying in their area, Olga observed birds and insects dropping dead in her garden. During that time, the DDT was sprayed at a rate of 2 pounds per acre. The day Olga's property was sprayed, the pilot had extra DDT fuel oil in his tank, and he decided to dump it over Olga's land. As a former Boston newspaper reporter, Olga voiced her anger and frustration in the best way she knew how. She wrote about it. Olga wrote, quote, "The harmless shower bath killed 7 of our lovely songbirds outright. We picked up 3 dead bodies the next morning right by our door. They were birds that had lived close to us, trusted us, and built their nests in our trees year after year." After writing the paper, Olga wrote another letter to her old friend named Rachel Carson. Olga wanted Rachel to help her find people in Washington who could provide more information about the aerial spraying of DDT. Olga's letter sparked 4 years of research for Rachel. She put it all together in a book called Silent Spring. Rachel's book opened people's eyes to the hazards of DDT, and public opinion eventually forced the banning of DDT in 1972. Today, Olga and Stuart's property has new owners, Judith and Robert Vose III. They continue to preserve the site as a bird sanctuary and also as a way to honor the brave women who stepped forward when it was put in harm's way. Olga Huckins and Rachel Carson. And today is the anniversary of the death of the former curator at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, the devoted scientist Otto Emery Jennings. He died at the age of 86 on this day in 1964. 60 years earlier, in 1904, Jennings started out as the custodian at the Carnegie Museum. Otto kept climbing the ladder, and over the span of 41 years, he was ultimately named the director of the museum in 1945. Over his long career, he had been chief curator and bottle washer. Today, the Jennings Nature Reserve near Butler, Pennsylvania, is named for Otto, who initiated its protection to save the blazing star, Liatris spicata. The 20-acre reserve was expressly cleared to enable the blazing star to spread and multiply. Other common names for the blazing star include the gayfeather or prairie star, this North American native plant and late-blooming prairie flower offers stately plumes of purple or white. And the many wonderful characteristics of the blazing star make it a favorite with gardeners. It's easy to grow and propagate, it's low maintenance, it makes excellent cut flowers, and the pollinators love them. Monarchs go crazy for blazing star. The blazing star grows up to 16 inches tall, and gardeners should note that it has a taller cousin called prairie blazing star that can grow to be 5 feet tall. In unearthed words, today is the anniversary of the death of the American lyric poet Sarah Teasdale, who died on this day in 1933. In 1918, Teasdale was awarded the Columbia Poetry Prize, which would later become known as the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Teasdale was born into a privileged life in St. Louis. After writing many books on poetry, she ended up in New York, where, depressed and disillusioned, she took her own life on this day in 1933. Her poem, The Garden, doesn't require a great deal of analysis, but gardeners, especially during this time of year, will relate to her longing for spring. Here's The Garden by Sarah Teasdale. My heart is a garden, tired with autumn, heaped with bending asters and dahlias heavy and dark. In the hazy sunshine, the garden remembers April, the drench of rains, and a snowdrop quick and clear as a spark, daffodils blowing in the cold wind of morning, and golden tulips, goblets holding the rain. The garden will be hushed with snow, forgotten soon, forgotten. After the stillness, will spring come again? And today is the anniversary of the death of the American poet Robert Frost, who died on this day in 1963. Frost died at the age of 88 after having a heart attack. 47 years earlier, Robert wrote a poem about a girl who asked her father for a little piece of land so that she could start a garden. The result was this poem called A Girl's Garden, written in 1916. A neighbor of mine in the village likes to tell how one spring, when she was a girl on the farm, she did a childlike thing. One day she asked her father to give her a garden plot to plant and tend and reap herself. And he said, why not? And casting about for a corner, he thought of an idle bit of walled-off ground where a shop had stood. And he said, just it. And he said, that ought to make you an ideal one-girl farm and give you a chance to put some strength on your slim Jim arm. It was not enough of a garden, her father said, to plow, so she had to work it all by hand, but she don't mind now. She wheeled the dung in a wheelbarrow along a stretch of road, but she always ran away and left her not nice load and hid from anyone passing. And then she begged the seed. She says she thinks she planted one of all things but weed. A hill each of potatoes, radishes, lettuce, peas, tomatoes, beets, beans, pumpkins, corn, and even fruit trees. And yes, she has long mistrusted that a cider apple in bearing there today is hers, or at least may be. Her crop was a miscellany, when all was said and done, a little bit of everything, a great deal of none. Now when she sees in the village how village things go, just when it seems to come in right, she says, I know. It's as when I was a farmer. Oh, never by way of advice. And she never sins by telling the tale to the same person twice. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Hippie Food by Jonathan Kaufman. The subtitle to this book is How Back to the Landers, Longhairs, and Revolutionaries Changed the Way We Eat. This book came out a year ago, released in January of 2019 by Jonathan Kaufman. It was well received and was a 2019 James Beard Award nominee. I think what gardeners will enjoy about this book is that Jonathan is a food writer and an impeccable researcher. His topic, hippie food, covers the origins of staples like sprouts, yogurt, tofu, brown rice, and whole grain bread. How did these foods get introduced and become so ubiquitous in our diets? Here's a quick excerpt for you. For those of you who didn't grow up eating lentil and brown rice casseroles, it may be hard to recognize what came to be called hippie food. That's because so many of the ingredients that the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s adopted defined the suspicion and disgust of the rest of the country have become foods many of us eat every day. The organic chard you bought at Kroger last week? Well, in the early 70s, farming organically was considered a delusional act. Jonathan's writing has been compared to a mix of Tom Wolfe and Michael Pollan. His book is a glimpse into our lives today, and gardeners will appreciate the influence of gardens on our modern-day tables. You can get a used copy of Hippie Food by Jonathan Kaufman and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for under $6. And here's a great gift for gardeners. It's the Love and Joy Vintage Floral Fabric Cotton Bunting. This lovely floral banner is made of white cotton fabric and has many miniature flowers in a pink, purple, and light green pattern with stems and leaves. It's adorable. If you're thinking of hosting any kind of party on your porch or in your garden, this banner is perfect. The banner is about 7 feet of fabric bunting along with 2 feet of string. You can get this cotton bunting with the floral fabric using the link in today's show notes for $8.19. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. Today is the anniversary of the death of the founder of the Home Orchard Society, Larry L. McGraw, who died on this day in 2005. His obituary stated that pomology was his passion for more than 50 years. Pomology is the science of growing fruit. In an effort to preserve fruit trees in the Northwest, Larry began collecting scion wood specimens in his 20s. He founded the Northwest Fruit Explorers, which was an organization that acted as a clearinghouse for fruit information and fruit growers in the Northwest. During his retirement, Larry worked as a horticulturist for the Oregon Historical Society. One day, Larry discovered an envelope that contained apple seeds that were 100 years old. The letter inside the envelope referenced Marcus Whitman and his orchard. Marcus Whitman was a doctor who led a group of settlers west to Washington state by wagon train. His wife was named Narcissa, and she was very bright, a teacher of physics and chemistry. Marcus and Narcissa were part of a group of missionaries. They settled in an area now known as Walla Walla, Washington. And apparently, they had an orchard. Beyond that, their time in Washington was not fruitful. They attempted to convert the local Native Americans to Christianity, but were unsuccessful, mainly because they didn't bother to get to know or understand them. Their only daughter drowned when she was 2 years old, and Narcissa's eyesight began to fail. When the Indians came down with measles, they blamed the settlers, specifically blaming Marcus since he was the town doctor. After almost all of the Indian children died, the surviving Indians launched an attack on the settlers and killed Marcus and Narcissa in their home on November 29th, 1847. The event became known as the Whitman Massacre. The seeds that Larry found were one of the last pieces of the Whitman legacy. Larry's attempts to germinate the Whitman apple seeds were unsuccessful. However, Larry did successfully obtain apple trees from Russia for his Portland orchard. By 1973, Larry had over 300 varieties of apples growing in his garden. 2 years later, in May of 1975, Larry hosted a meeting with a group of other orchard growers. It was the first official meeting of the Home Orchard Society. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener, and remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced weekdays in lovely Maple Grove, Minnesota. You can find complete show notes over at thedailygardener.org, and be sure to share the show with your garden friends. You can find The Daily Gardener on all your favorite social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest, and of course, Facebook. While you're over at Facebook, don't forget to join the Daily Gardener community. Just search for these 3 words, Daily Gardener Community. The group will pop right up and then request to join. Finally, I want to thank my team at Podfly Productions, where my fabulous editor is Eric Begay. Have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.